Anastasia, in general, signs are present today and continue to work, but people lack knowledge about them. Rigdon, perfectly true. This is the result mankind has arrived at. It is not only the knowledge that has been lost but even the semantic meaning of the words that certain symbols and signs meant as a complex. Here is a simple example. Let us consider, for instance, the word symbol, which is currently used in everyday life by the Russian-speaking population. It is borrowed from the Greek language. But how did it appear in ancient Greece? In ancient Greece, there existed such a word as shma, meaning a sign, a banner, a heavenly sign. It should be noted that the ancient cultures of the Aegean region, even before Greece appeared, especially after those peoples came into contact with the Eastern peoples, for instance, with the inhabitants of Anatolia, now the territory of Turkey, and with the ancient Egyptians, who had developed sacred writings and occult knowledge, much of the knowledge of the invisible world was explained by means of the allegories understandable to the inhabitants of a certain locality. For example, the process and the results of a joint meditation of a group of people who were working with signs, or for specific setting of a working sign that influenced the masses, were explained to the initiate newcomers simply by using associations they could easily understand. The area of influence the sign covered was associatively compared to casting a net into the sea by fishermen, for the profession of a fisherman was very popular in those times. They were told that if the sign was set in a certain place, for instance, in a room, temple, or in the square, it would influence the people within this space, roughly speaking, like a net set in a certain part of the sea during fishing. In short, in ancient times they used such allegories which the people of that era could understand. Today, of course, all this can be explained to people using modern examples. For instance, the influence of certain signs and symbols can be compared to the radio receiver that operates at a predetermined frequency and distributes radio waves to certain distances, or to the light of the street lamp which illuminates a certain part of the street. And even then, these will still be allegories, because modern people are also very far from understanding the phenomena related to the processes taking place in other dimensions. So then, it is precisely due to such associative comparison, which was common in secret societies, that the word tusumbulan appeared in everyday lexicon of people, who, as the Russian proverb says, heard ringing but do not know where it comes from, and this word started to mean a group practice of several fishermen casting nets when fishing. Well, it's the same old story. Those who know nothing about the spiritual side of the matter always equate the meaning of the knowledge they have heard to objects and phenomena of the material world, based on their material understanding. But at the same time this word tusumbulan continued to be used by people initiated into the knowledge. As a result, along with the more ancient word shma, meaning a sign, a banner, a heavenly sign, the word symbol came to be used in the following meanings: joining the invisible with the visible, locating the invisible reality through a visible sign, the secret meaning of which is understood only by a certain group of people. And later on symbol totally replaced this ancient word. It is also important to know how the archons react to the growth in popularity among people of knowledge which came from secret spiritual societies. I shall once again use the word symbol as an example. When this word began to gain significance among the population precisely in its primordial meaning, the Freemasons interfered in this matter. They began to establish on the territory of Greece their different guilds, corporations, societies, religions, parties, and to place their signs and symbols as public signs of distinction of these organizations. They began to dirty the word symbol with the semantic meaning of ordinary human matters, use it in various aspects of everyday life, as diplomatic agreements, as tickets to the theater, as names of signet rings of the Athenian judges, and as a name of a share of monetary membership contribution. Echoes of these perversions can be found also today. As a result, the primordial meaning of the word symbol came to be forgotten and began to disappear from everyday use. However, interestingly enough, the word symbol came into the Russian language exactly in the meaning of sign. And the word sign, znak, translator's note, originated in the Russian language from the Old Slavonic word to know and to have information about something, the Old Russian and Ukrainian word, the Slovenian zina ti, the Old Czech zina ti, the Polish zina, and so on. That is, the word, to know, translator's note, was clear to any Slav, regardless of the existing differences in languages. As a matter of fact, in some sense, it reflected exactly the original meaning of the Greek word symbol. So, this is just one of the many examples of transformation of the word that means sign and symbol. Actually, every nationality had their own definitions of a sign and a symbol, but not every nation today remembers their original meanings. If people had known these original meanings, they would be surprised how identical in meaning they are among the different peoples which in the ancient times lived at considerable distances from each other and were separated by oceans. Clearly, it is difficult for people to advance in cognizing the issue of symbols and signs without having the primary basis of the knowledge, thanks to which one can view the overall situation over millennia. But this can be corrected. Thus, there exist several working signs which have constantly been present in human society, regardless of whether the current generation of people knows about them or not. There is also basic knowledge of other signs and symbolism. From the earliest times, the latter were the bearers of certain encoded knowledge about the human being, his energy structure, and also his abilities in the invisible world, including the main one, spiritual liberation. Since ancient times, the basic signs and symbols have been placed according to specific purposes, depending on their use. In some cases, this was a transfer of knowledge, while in others they were placed as an element of direct influence upon the one looking at them. When the goal was to pass on the knowledge, signs and symbols were drawn by the type of seal. I shall explain using a simple example. When a person looks at his photograph, the right side of the photograph corresponds to his left hand, whereas the left side of the photograph corresponds to his right hand. It is the same thing on the seal when you look at the original and compare it with its impression. The same applies to the signs related to transfer of the knowledge, especially the ones designating the right and the left essences. Figure 16. Sample image of a basic symbol intended for transferring the knowledge. The right and the left sides are of the seal type. And if the case was about the signs and symbols that were intended for exerting a certain influence on the person looking at them, they were placed strictly according to the actual sides. For example, if it was necessary to activate the right essence of man, then the corresponding sign or symbol was placed in front of the right side of the person looking at them, and so on. There were many other nuances, which were already invented by people, about how to read these signs, from left to right or from right to left, from bottom to top or vice versa. But this is already specificity related to the local traditions of different ancient peoples, although it, too, in its turn, was based on certain information. But we are not talking about that now. Figure 17. Sample images of symbols and signs intended for the activation of the lateral essences. A symbolical sign of activation of the right essence, the small arc corresponds to the right essence of the person looking at the sign. A sign of activation of the left essence, the large arc corresponds to the left essence of the person looking at the sign. Let us consider the basic knowledge about the four essences of man and the soul which was known to people since ancient times. Originally, designation of an ordinary human being was in the form of an equilateral cross with a circle in the center. A simplified version was simply an equilateral cross. The horizontal line of the cross designated connection with matter, while the vertical line meant the connection with the spiritual world, or rather, it indicated the presence of elements from the spiritual world in man and the possibility of spiritual elevation. That is why, as a matter of fact, different peoples subsequently associated the horizontal line with the element of earth, with the material, earthly, world, inward movement, and also with time, as movement from the past to the future, a vector, west-east, and with a line separating heaven and earth. And the vertical line was associated with the elements of fire and air and their initial upward direction from the material sphere to the spiritual one. The four-pointed structure of the equilateral cross and a circle inside it, the four main essences and the soul, denoted the principal elements in the human structure which embodied the main plan, the creation of conditions for a personality's choice between the material world and the spiritual one. Figure 18. The symbol of the human being, an equilateral cross with a circle. The symbol scheme, of the seal type, indicates the symbol of the soul, the circle, in the center and the main essences of man on the four sides from it. The circle is an ancient symbol of the soul or of a manifestation from the spiritual world, including a spiritual being, a symbol of God's presence, a designation of the sacred sound of Ra. This is a circumference which symbolically bound and contained within itself a part of the great void. Given that the soul is true antimatter, that is, a force coming from the spiritual world, then in the understanding of the material thinking it is nothing. Sometimes, it was depicted as a dot in the center of a circle as a symbol of concentrated energy from the spiritual world. In some cases, this was the designation for the initial stage of spiritual development, awakening. And the circle itself symbolized spiritual powers, a characteristic of the soul in the meaning of perfection, wholeness, constancy, eternity, a designation of the spiritual world, an existence which has neither beginning nor end. There is another remarkable fact. In the human structure, the soul is surrounded by information shells, subpersonalities. But all this is also enclosed in a shell consisting of life energy of human, prana. It is prana that is a kind of an interlayer between the energy of the soul and the material world. In the mythology of the peoples of the world, especially where such sacred, spiritual, knowledge about man was reflected, often an associative parallel was drawn between the energy of prana and fire characteristics of the sun. Hence, designation of the soul as a solar disk. The circle also denoted demarcation of the two spheres, the material and the spiritual. When it came to the knowledge about human, this pointed to information about the soul being, so to speak, in the intermediate state. Figure 19. Symbol of the soul and of the spiritual world, circle. Sometimes, together with the circle, elements were depicted that gave it dynamics, for instance, wings, lotus petals, rays, winding snakes, or tongues of flame. Such images can be found in the sacred symbols of the Tripoli, ancient Indian, ancient Egyptian, ancient Mexican, Sumerian, and ancient Russian cultures. This meant the spiritual growth of man or indicated spiritual knowledge, teaching, introduced into this world by a being from the spiritual world. It also showed the direction of movement from the inside to the outside, which is a characteristic of the power of the soul that pushes the personality towards a choice and the search of spiritual ways for liberation from the captivity of matter. Often in cosmological myths, the ancients enclosed the general scheme of the world in a circle. In such a case, this pointed to creation, formation, of the material world by the spiritual world. 1, 2, 3. Figure 20. Symbol of spiritual growth and spiritual knowledge, a circle with elements that convey dynamics. The Ajna chakra, a conditional designation in spiritual practices of ancient India of the chakran located in the center of the forehead, the third eye, in the form of a circle with two lotus petals, in blue color, with accompanying designations of the forces of Allat, triangle pointing down and the AllatRA sign. Winged solar disk, ancient Egypt, a symbol of spiritual knowledge introduced from heaven, the symbol of the solar gods of different peoples, for example, Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrianism, Assyrian Ashur, Babylonian Shamash, and also one of the designations of the ancient Egyptian god Ra. An example of the sacred solar symbol which was typical for transfer of knowledge in the ancient times, the Paleolithic period. The pattern is made of a certain number of grains. It symbolizes the general structure, the seven-dimensional space enclosed in a circle, where beyond the circle there are 72 grains, meaning the overall number of dimensions in the universe. Inside the circle, there are 7 pyramidal forms with bundles consisting of 7 grains, which are crowned by a structure consisting of 5 seeds, the central one and 4 seeds located crosswise around it. In the center of the image, there is a 7-petaled flower, a 7-pointed star, the center of which is fringed with 33 grains, while each part of the petal consists of 6 grains. Anastasia, yes, knowledge about the sacred meaning of the circle is recorded in the symbols and signs not only of rock drawings and frescoes on house walls but also of archaeological objects, sacred sculptures, ritual clothing, ceramics, and so on. They have also been preserved in the architecture of ancient temple buildings and simple dwellings, marquees and yurts. Traditional ritual acts of certain beliefs also reflect this knowledge. For instance, ritual walking in a circle around a certain territory or a building, performance of circular dances, ritual circle dances around an invisible center or fire, a sacred place. Spinning of shamans and dervishes, solemn sitting of sages in a circle to communicate, where the center of the circle was empty, not filled with anything, as a symbol of the spiritual nature. Rigdan, by the way, in ancient times people would build their towns similarly, that is, they would place buildings in them exactly in a circle, leaving the center of the town also empty, not built up, in a form of a round square. First and foremost, such a building plan had deep sacred meaning. Anastasia, modern cities obviously lack this, although archaeological examples of such ancient buildings are in existence today. For example, thousands of years ago such a principle was used for building settlements of the Tripoli civilization in the Danube and Dnieper interfluve. The cities in the ancient Urals built based on the Archaim prototype were also constructed in the same way. For instance, the so-called by archaeologists Sintashta culture, the country of towns which was discovered by archaeologists on the territory of Russia, Chelyabinsk Oblast, translator's note, Oblast means county, Orenburg Oblast, Bashkortostan, and northern Kazakhstan. 1-2. Figure 21. Layouts of ancient towns arranged in a circle. A copy of an aerial photograph of the Tripoli settlement. Petrin, Moldova. Scheme layout of the town of Archaim, Southern Urals, Russia. Rigdan, exactly so. But let us go back to the ancient symbol of human being, an equilateral cross with a circle in the center. The lines of the cross conditionally designate the 4 essences of man, the lateral essences, the horizontal lines coming from the center, the back essence, the vertical line going down from the center, and the front essence, the vertical line going up from the center. As I have already said, in associative comparisons the characteristics of these essences were allotted to certain forces in space, for example, the 4 elements, the 4 seasonal winds, and also the 4 cardinal directions. At that, 3 forces were usually closely interconnected with each other or had negative characteristics of the back and the lateral essences. And the 4th was the leading one, very special in its properties, and had positive characteristics of the front essence. All these forces were also designated with the cross, which is the sacred symbol of a human being as one whose structure combines spirit and matter. The vertical line of the cross was associated with the solstice, the movement towards the spiritual world, with the human's aspiration for the spiritual nature to prevail in him. That is why on the head of sacred gods in the religious traditions of the ancient peoples of the world, a solar disk was often depicted as a symbol of supremacy of the spiritual nature and of knowledge introduced from the spiritual world. The horizontal line indicating the lateral essences was allegorically called the axis of equinox, associating it with the movement of the sun, when the sun crosses the celestial equator at the vernal and autumnal equinoxes. Anastasia, yes, this can be traced even now by monuments of the ancient culture. For example, a very interesting bas-relief has been preserved in the ancient Persian city of Persepolis. There also exists its more ancient name which, when translated from the Persian language, means the throne of Jamshid. It depicts a symbol of the Zoroastrian New Year holiday, Navruz, which the Persian, Iranian, and the Turkic peoples celebrate in accordance with the solar calendar. So, the most interesting thing is that the symbol is a bull, the right essence, and a lion, the left essence, eternally fighting each other. In ancient times it was believed that on certain days of the year their powers became equal. Rigden, that is right. This is exactly why later on people began to link these symbols to days of the solar equinox in nature. Although all this has a different underlying message. The secret meaning of the knowledge about the four essences of man also went into the notions that were equivalent to the cross. Anastasia, majority of modern people associate the cross only with one world religion, Christianity. In turn, ministers of this religion do their utmost to prevent people from being interested in anything greater. After all, the cross is a very ancient symbol and it had appeared long before the emergence of this religion. Images of crosses and their modifications have been known since the Paleolithic period. For example, a symbol of the cross was found on the monuments dated to the time of the primitive society. Let us take, for instance, images of the Chauvet Cave, France, which are 20,000 years old and which have been very well preserved thanks to the microclimate of the cave. Rigden, and even then, it should be mentioned that these discoveries have been made relatively recently. And how many more of such places exist which are still unknown to mankind as of today. But such artifacts are valuable only when people understand the primordial meaning of symbols and not just admire the amazing art of the ancients, linking these designations with concepts from the human mind which are imposed by modern religions. Different variations of the cross symbolically indicated additional information to its main interpretation. 4. Example, if the tips of the cross had three spheres, that indicated the three-dimensionality of the world where the human being resided, or it represented a numerical characteristic of the phenomena that were denoted in the form of an additional sign on the cross. If the lower part of a cross, which corresponded to the back essence, was elongated, the so-called long or Latin cross, that meant focus of attention, concentration on the back essence, continuous suffering, a reminder of the past that burdened the soul, stimulation of the sense of guilt and resentment. As you already understand, if a person is in the state of the animal nature, such an activation of the back essence is, in fact, constant stimulation of depression, fear, and self-blame. Figure 22. Long or Latin cross. Anastasia, at that, Christian believers are imposed upon to wear this particular form of a cross, supposedly as a symbol of Christ's sufferings. So does this mean that instead of love for God, people are indirectly looped on the thoughts about their suffering, the past, and death? In other words, with this symbol, they subconsciously activate in people negativity related to nothing else but their own past? So this is actually nothing more than a stimulation of the activation of the back essence. Rigden, this is exactly one of the elements we have already discussed, I mean, manipulations with signs in temples. And in this case not only the back essence has been emphasized. As a rule, the reverse of such a cross has the following inscription in the Latin letters, INRI, Isis Nazarenus, Rex Iudiorum, which means Jesus of Nazareth, the King of Judea. Anastasia, I see, they even hammer into the subconscious of believers the supremacy of a certain people over them. And why is there no symbol of the soul here, of love for God? Rigden, with a smile, well, as you see, when a person has knowledge, he starts asking questions that are inconvenient for the priests in power. How can they place such a symbol if the aims and objectives, according to their big books, are entirely different? They speak of soul salvation only in theory meant for the masses, but in reality, you see for yourself, what is going on. Anastasia, yes, unfortunately, in practice, in contrast to theory, nobody has abolished slavery, they have simply perfected and camouflaged it well as democratic liberty, having thus created a mere illusion of freedom and equality. Rigden, I will say even more than that. As I have already mentioned, the Latin cross as a symbol of Christianity was introduced in the 4th century AD when the teaching of Jesus had been transformed into a religion, and the religion gained national status. Incidentally, in genealogy, the Latin cross usually marks the end of a person, the date of death. So, in Christianity, Besides this four-pointed long cross intended for believers to wear, there also exists six-pointed and eight-pointed so-called patriarchal crosses with two or three additional bars which, as a rule, cross out the front essence. They are worn by archbishops and cardinals. The general concept of this religion interprets the presence of this upper bar as a board, plate, for the aforementioned title of Jesus in the Latin abbreviation, INRI. And if the sign also had a lower slanting bar, the believer was simply explained in the material context of the religious interpretation that this was supposedly a bar for Jesus' feet. 1, 2, 3. Figure 23. Patriarchal crosses. The patriarchal cross, a six-pointed cross with two bars. The Orthodox cross, an eight-pointed cross with a top bar and a lower slanting diagonal cross, renunciation of the human past. The papal cross, three horizontal bars symbolize material power in the three-dimensional world. In all the cases, the top bar, which crosses out the front essence, forms an equilateral cross, that is, above the long horizontal line, there is an equilateral cross, the symbol of a human being, of human power. Now, let us consider concealment of the interpretation of symbolism of the cross from the masses, which had existed long before the emergence of the Christian religion. For example, in ancient Egypt, such designations of the crosses which are currently known as the Tau cross and the Ankh cross were popular. In the secret knowledge, the Tau cross meant, using the modern language, the human life in the material world, a manifestation of the emotions and thoughts initiated by the back and the lateral essences. Whereas the Ankh cross already combined two different elements, the dominant circle and a Tau cross hanging from it. The Ankh cross symbolized the perfect human, with the spiritual nature dominating in him, the prevalence of the front essence over the three other essences and domination of the spiritual over the material. This is why the Ankh cross was placed in the hands of the supreme ancient Egyptian gods as a spiritual symbol, a sign of immortality, of eternal life. The Ankh cross is also known as the key of life, the key to energy, the key to revival, of spiritual transformation. Such meanings were related to the symbolism of a certain stage of spiritual practices when a person's self-unfolding took place, a qualitative transformation of man into an entirely different spiritual being. Moreover, knowledge about this cross and its symbolism existed not only in ancient Egypt, Africa, but also in ancient Europe, Asia, and America. 1, 2. Figure 24. The Tau cross and the Ankh cross. Sample images of the Tau cross. Sample images of the Ankh cross. So, when an equilateral cross was placed on the Tau cross, that meant the power of man over the essences in the three-dimensional world, while human qualities, the animal nature, dominated in him. In ancient times, such a symbol was usually used in magic, divination, fortune-telling, healing, and so on. If an equilateral cross was enclosed in a circle and placed above the Tau cross, it meant the death of a person dominated by the material, animal, nature during his life. Simply put, this symbol meant leaving for reincarnation. But other meanings of it existed as well. Anastasia, so it means that the patriarchal cross is, in fact, an equilateral cross above the Tau cross, a symbol of power over the material world through magic. This is also crossing out the front essence, so that means it is a rejection of the spiritual in favor of the material. Rigden, quite right. And the bar in the lower part of the cross means a refusal of your human past and devoting yourself to service. Only the question remains open, service to whom? An answer to it is found in the meaning of the dominant sign in the symbol. As for the long cross with an indication of three bars as stairs leading upwards, which today is called the papal cross, since ancient times such a sign has been used to indicate the one who sought power over the three-dimensional world, when the symbolism of an individual person was involved. However, such delicate details are naturally never disclosed to believers. This happens partly because the hierarchical top group of people conceals them, and partly because ordinary religious ministers, who adhere to the traditional interpretation of this religion, are unaware of this information. And the latter was invented, during formation of the main concept of a given religion, to somehow explain this ancient symbol to the masses. Perhaps, I shall give a simple example for a better understanding. If we ask a believer who wears a cross next to the skin what he feels when he remembers about it, sees its reflection in the mirror on his body, or touches it, we may then hear the answer which is quite standard in such cases. The person will say that at this moment he recalls the suffering of Jesus Christ during the crucifixion and that he feels a sense of guilt and his own sinfulness. Such an answer is typical of almost all the believers of this religion. Note that at this moment they do not recall the teaching of Christ, his sermons, and guidance, do not think about the salvation of their soul, about love for God, but instead, they feel a sense of guilt and suffering and experience fear. Why? Because the back and the right essences become active in their energy structures. This is a telling example of how signs and symbols work, influence at the subconscious level, and how priests use them in their systems to control the masses. It is no wonder they conceal the primordial knowledge from people. Otherwise, if people knew about it, they would start asking questions that are awkward for the religious leaders. For example, why they, the believers, are wearing a symbol that imputes a sense of guilt in them, leads them into depression at the subconscious level, stimulates suffering and negative memories about their past, while religious ministers are wearing a symbol of power over the material world. After all, by definition, both of them in their faith should be striving for love of God, the salvation of the soul, and for the spiritual world. Anastasia, yes, when you begin to comprehend what kind of signs and symbols they surround you with from all sides, understanding comes why the material mind dominates the society, even in places where people try to find a spiritual outlet for themselves. Rigdon, I have already said this many times and I shall also repeat now, it is in the hands of people themselves to change the situation, everything depends on the dominant choice of each person. But let us get back to the topic of the signs of the four essences. If the equilateral cross was a symbol of a regular person, then the diagonal cross, turned cross, and its variations, often with a circle in the center, referred to a personality which is moving along the path of knowledge and which is aware of sacred information about the human being and the meditative practices related to the four essences. I emphasize, to a person who has knowledge, how he uses it, with which dominant in consciousness, is his personal choice. Figure 25. An equilateral diagonal cross with a circle in the center is a symbol of the knowledge about the four essences of man and about the soul. The diagonal cross is a symbol of progress in cognition and a conditional division of space into fields, zones, of influence of the essences. The circle is the designation of the soul. The interpretation of the pattern of the symbol is shown in seal type. But most often, in the sacred texts, the symbol of the diagonal cross, or its variations, pointed at the knowledge about the energy structure of a human, his essences, and interconnection with dimensions. Dimensions were conditionally represented as a number of steps of a truncated pyramid or a staircase, parts of patterns, lotus buds or its petals, contours of mountains, zigzag lines, circles within a circle, little lines, grains, and points. As a rule, they were equal to 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 in number. A number of three identical elements of a symbol usually indicated three-dimensional space. 4, 3 dimensions plus the fourth one, time, and it could also serve as a symbol of the four essences. 5 represented 5-dimensional space, but generally, this figure was associated with a 5-pointed star as one of the symbols of the feminine principle, a sign of the manifested forces of AllatRA in the 5th dimension. 6 stood for the 6th dimension, which is the highest possible one for the person with the material dominant, from which he can influence the material world in an altered state of consciousness. And the presence of 7 identical elements in a pattern meant the 7th dimension, indicating a perfect person and the structure of the world up to the 7th dimension, or the concept of heaven, nirvana, and liberation of the soul. Sometimes 8, 9, 12, 13, and 33 or 72 conditional marks were depicted near the symbolic indication of the seventh dimension, pointing at the knowledge about the universe. Such sacred information was often recorded in patterns of ritual objects, garments, or sacred buildings. Variations of the diagonal cross were quite diverse. A diagonal cross in the form of four connected triangles with a circle in the center, circles centers of triangular spaces, clover crosses, narrow in the center and expanding out to the edges, snakes entwined in the form of a cross, and so on. Figure 26. Variations of the diagonal cross with markings of spaces of the four essences. If it was necessary to point at or emphasize the activation, dominance, or blocking of one of the essences or specific work with these essences, then this was marked with an additional sign in the corresponding area of the diagonal cross. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Figure 27. A symbolic indication of the emphasis of work with the four essences. Used as a reference to a symbol of 6 dimensions, an indication of spiritual knowledge or practices, blocking or activating the work of the lateral essences of human depending on the adjacent additional designations. Examples of conditional designations with signs of the work in meditation with various essences. Each of the symbols indicates emphasis or domination of the lateral essences in human. The symbol in its form reflects activation of the lateral essences which manifests as pressure from the outside to the inside and is reflected on the state of man as burdensome, negative, and oppressive feelings. The symbol indicates real deformation of personal space which takes place during this process. The symbol has the same meaning as the previous one but a different schematic representation. Anastasia, perhaps, it is worth emphasizing that it is the sacred or magical symbols, denoting the sacred knowledge of this or that people that we are talking about. In general, one can say that the main symbols of the four essences are triangles and hemispheres which touch each other but practically do not intersect. Rigdon, absolutely. At that, not simply triangles or just hemispheres. As a rule, these are equilateral triangles, the three sides of which point at three-dimensionality of the space from which the observer, personality, begins his journey of spiritual development. Two triangles lying horizontally with peaks touching each other symbolize the right and the left essences. Figure 28. Symbol of the right and the left essences of man. This is a kind of an infinity sign, a constant return to the same tenets from the world of matter, the so-called variable stability. This is a stable domination of either the right or the left essence, a flow of equal force from one area of catching, or rather, hunting for the attention of man, to another, if, of course, these two horizontal triangles are considered in the context of the person's life who does not control his thoughts. But this is typical precisely of the usual work of the lateral essences when the personality chooses thoughts and emotions from the animal nature. But if a person reaches heights in his spiritual development, then the lateral essences change their usual behavior. They become helpers, that force which, by its connection to other dimensions, helps to know the invisible diversity, conditional infinity, of this world. And the triangles pointing downwards and upwards are a special case which needs to be considered in more detail. Two vertically placed triangles that touch each other's vertices symbolize the front and the back essences. Figure 29. Symbol of the human's front essences. A triangle pointing downward. Symbol of the human's back essence is a triangle pointing upward. In the context of the original knowledge about the four essences of man, the triangle pointing upward was a symbol of the back essence, the past, and the visible manifested material world. It is not coincidental that people would later associate a triangle of such a shape specifically with male principle. Its meaning is far from greatness or likeness to a mountain towering towards heaven or to the three principles of construction of the universe, the symbol of God. The mountain is a separate image and symbol which is mainly associated with the concept of another dimension. And the symbol of God in the form of a triangle pointing upward signified the three principles of construction of the universe, God, the idea, lotus, the plan, and Allat, implementation of the idea and the plan. The equilateral triangle pointing upwards, according to the primordial knowledge about the human being, signifies two moments. Firstly, starting state of human, as an observer in a three-dimensional world prior to his independent spiritual development, as an object created in the image and likeness of God. The soul is initially enclosed in a person and three conditions of his spiritual development are set: the spiritual idea, the plan, and an implementation of the idea. Secondly, if we are actually speaking already about the process of human spiritual development itself, the emphasis of which shifts to the front essence, that is, to the upper triangle pointing downward, or, on the contrary, if we are speaking about the person that is bogged down in matter and in whom the animal nature dominates, then the meaning of the lower triangle was quite different. In this case, the triangle pointing upwards symbolizes not only the back essence but also aggression of the material world. That is why it was associated with the element of fire in some cases, movement of matter from expansion to contraction, from the outside to the inside, concentration on the will of the animal mind and its power over the pyramidal hierarchy of matter. In other words, the triangle pointing upwards means that which is based on the earthly, material, and temporal, and which strives for power. In the primordial knowledge, an equilateral triangle pointing down stands not only for the front essence, with the help of which the person grows and develops spiritually. Since ancient times, this symbol has meant the creating force of Allat, that is, movement of the spiritual from the primary point of implementation, from manifestation of the Creator's plan to constant creation and expansion, to perfect form contained in this plan. It is no coincidence that in the ancient times the triangle pointing downwards was associated with symbols of the feminine principle, with supreme goddesses who, in the beliefs of different peoples, embodied the creating functions of the Great Mother as the progenitress of the whole world, connection with the water environment, which was an association with the spiritual world. According to the sacred primordial knowledge about human, when the personality chooses the spiritual nature, a manifestation of the creating power of Allat happens in it in the form of spiritual awakening, an expanded state of consciousness, and manifestation of the spiritual love. That is why during spiritual practices a person experiences feelings of comprehension of everything, omniscience, and all-encompassing love for the whole world. This is precisely the work of his front essence and a manifestation of the powers of Allat which restore and manifest the connection of the personality with the soul. Echoes of this knowledge are traced in the sacred treatises about the world and man, in mythological stories, images, and rituals of many peoples of the world. Anastasia, incidentally, in the Tripoli civilization, for example, it was the symbols of two vertically placed triangles touching each other's vertices that were often depicted on ritual dishes, even with designation of the direction of energy movement during spiritual practices. 1, 2, 3. 4, 5, 6. Figure 30. Ancient designations of the knowledge about man and the processes of his spiritual development. Drawings on the ritual ceramics of the Tripoli civilization, 6th to 3rd millennium BC. General knowledge about the human structure, 3 dimensions in the lower triangle, 3 dimensions in the upper triangle, a symbol of the circle. Designation of a common person. Designation of a good person who begins his spiritual journey, head in the form of a square, a raised hand, and the emphasis in the upper triangle is made on the front essence. A figure in motion with raised hands is one of the sacred designations of the spiritual practice during the work with the right and the left essence. Designation of a spiritual practice, attainment of the highest spiritual state, and a connection with the 7th dimension. On the head, there is a circle with 7 enclosed circles, in which the upper circles form a triangle pointing downwards. The direction of the arms designate looping of energies. Designation of a person walking the spiritual path. It is shown that the front essence is dominating over the lateral essences and leading a person to another, higher world through the power of Allat. The person doubles and manifests in dimensions higher than the 3rd. Rigdan. Yes, these symbols are present everywhere, it is just that most people do not notice them, they are not interested in them, and they do not understand them too. to the absence of the primordial knowledge. For example, in ancient India, a triangle pointing downwards was used as a symbol of goddess Shakti, an associative image of manifestation of the powers of Allat, whom I have already mentioned. And for god Shiva, one of the three deities in the Indian mythology that embodied also the destructive forces, it was a triangle pointing upwards. Here is another example. When the Greeks visited the banks of the triangle estuary of the great river of ancient Egypt, the Nile, they started calling it Delta. For ancient Egyptians, this estuary, which gave access to the sea, just like the life-sustaining river itself, was comparable to the sacred lotus, to a triangle pointing downwards which embodied the feminine principle. And the delta base, having multiple channels which lead out to the sea, the aquatic environment, was associated with spiritual paths which, in the sacred interpretations of the ancient Egyptians, were associated with another, spiritual world. Many of the ancient Egyptian goddesses, endowed with functions of Allat, were mistresses of the aquatic environment or were connected to it and to a lotus. That is why among the Greeks, too, the delta became a symbol of the feminine principle, the door of life, despite the fact that the word itself is derived from the fourth letter of the Greek alphabet, the form of which is a triangle pointing upwards. All in all, it is worthwhile to look more closely at least at the known history of different cultures, and one can find a lot of interesting information. I am not even mentioning the long-forgotten cultures which modern people do not remember, but the archaeological discoveries of which will shake the world in the future with their unique artifacts and spiritual knowledge, provided, of course, that humanity will have this future. And a few more words about a variation of the symbolism of overlaying of a triangle pointing downwards and a triangle pointing upwards over each other which has been widespread among mystical, occult, and religious movements since ancient times. According to the primordial knowledge, if the main, top, triangle in the symbol is pointing downwards, is depicted in white color, the divine feminine principle, the forces of the spiritual world, and beneath it, you can see its edges, there is a triangle pointing upwards in black color, the masculine principle, forces of matter, then this means supremacy of the spiritual world and of the creating forces of Allat over the material world in six-dimensional space. Figure 31. An ancient symbol of the supremacy of the spiritual world over the material world. And if the triangle pointing upwards overlaps the triangle pointing downwards, it means dominance of the animal mind, the material world over the spiritual one, a magical influence on matter from the sixth dimension with the dominance of the animal nature, man's use of the powers of Allat not for spiritual liberation but for gaining power in the material world. Such a sign, so to speak, with exactly the opposite meaning, as a rule, was placed by people seeking secret power over the three-dimensional world and serving the will and aims of the animal mind. If the sign was depicted simply without indicating the dominating triangle, it was also called the reverse sign because the triangles of the front and the back essences were interchanged in it and the lateral essences were dominant, with indication of them as triangles located in the vertical. It also meant crossing out of the rhombus, one of the symbols of the spiritual transformation of man. In ancient times, this symbol was used mainly in black magic. Figure 32. Reverse sign. Anastasia, this symbol, by the way, is now widely popularized all over the world under the name of the Star of David, naturally, with a plausible interpretation for the broad masses of the perfect union of spirit and matter with the dominant triangle pointing upwards. And then people wonder why they live in such an unhappy world, where there is a lot of anger and aggression. Rigdon, well, who is to blame that people are not interested in more than what is being imposed on them by the material mind? In ancient times in the East, this sign was known as the ruler of jinns, a magical symbol of the person ruling over matter with help of powers intended for spiritual development. If one or more triangles pointing downwards were placed inside a large triangle pointing upwards, this meant man's use of his unique spiritual powers for other purposes, that is, for obtaining certain power in the material world. For example, if three triangles pointing downwards were placed inside a triangle pointing upwards, then this meant the use of the powers of AllatRA by the material mind for its own purposes, as a rule, for achieving temporary power in the three-dimensional world. Incidentally, three triangles pointing downwards symbolize the divine principles, the idea, the plan, and its implementation, the realization of this plan. In ancient images, one can see three triangles pointing downwards that are not restricted by anything. On top of them, a fourth large triangle pointing downwards is placed, which means man's movement towards spiritual liberation. In short, the right use by a person of his life force. Anastasia, please, tell the readers more about hemispheres. They are also quite common in patterns of sacred ritual objects and on ancient artifacts as a conditional designation of the four essences. Rigden, yes, for designation of the four essences, they also used the symbols of semicircle, crescent, and arc as a certain part of the whole. This being said, the lateral arcs, which were located vertically, were symbols of the lateral essences. The arc that resembled an overturned crescent or a bowl placed upside down symbolized the back essence, and that is why in the sacred symbolism of peoples it was associated with the past that was deprived of life, and it also meant a dead teaching, oriented towards the material. However, the sign of an arc or a crescent with horns pointing upwards was originally used to designate the front essence as a symbol of manifestation of the powers of the spiritual world, AllatRA. This, strictly speaking, gave rise to the appearance of designations of other essences precisely in the form of distinctive arcs and hemispheres. Thanks to such a depiction of the front essence and of the sign of AllatRA, some peoples acquired associative symbol of a bowl as a spiritual container which is ready to be filled with creating powers of AllatRA, or, in the beliefs of the ancients, with crystal clear water which was an association with the spiritual world. Figure 33. Schematic designation of humans' essences as arcs. 1 2 3 4 5 6. Figure 34. Symbolic representation of humans' essences as arcs and crescents with the sign of AllatRA. The moon cross, also known as the Croissante cross, was a common sacred symbol among the ancient peoples of Northern Europe. The pattern of a ritual dish of the Tripoli civilization with a cross and crescents at the ends, the 4th to 3rd millennium BC. Symbols of arcs on an artifact of the pre-Christian period of history of Vyatiki, Old Russian Eastern Slavic tribes who lived in the Oka River basin. A ritual plate of the Tripoli civilization with the sign of AllatRA in the center. Signs on ceramics of the Tripoli civilization, from archaeological findings near village Bernashivka of Vinnytsia region, Ukraine. A sacred painting made of colored sand of the Indian Navajo people, U.S. Southwest, North America. Anastasia, you have mentioned the rhombus as one of the symbols of human spiritual transformation. Please tell, at least in general, about symbols of the square shapes, about the rhombus and the square itself. As of today, people often confuse the meaning of these symbols because they rely on modern interpretations of the ancient knowledge which has already been largely distorted and interpreted at the level of the material worldview. Rigden, the square in the symbolism of the primordial knowledge is a conditional base of the pyramidal-shaped human structure, which links all his main essences. Consequently, different peoples associated the square with a symbol of the earth, everything earthly, with the union of the four elements, of cardinal points, with the masculine principle, as opposed to the circle which served as a symbol of the feminine principle and the sky. Figure 35. Square, a symbol of the earthly. This knowledge was reflected in the structure of many religious buildings of different nations of the world. For example, ziggurats, pyramids, temples, pagodas, churches, and other sacred buildings were built on a square base. At that, as a rule, the architecture of the building itself, in one way or another, reflected knowledge about the transformation of the square into a circle or a rhombus, which was a schematic representation of a cube set on one of its corners. That is, these symbols recorded the knowledge about energy transformation of the human structure during his spiritual liberation, the transition of the spiritual personality from the material world into the spiritual one. A rhombus was also often depicted in the form of an oval seed with slightly pointed top and bottom vertices and was associated with a symbol of the feminine principle, life energy, and of fertility of the goddesses who, as a rule, were endowed with functions of the Great Mother. It was designated with signs of fusion of two forces which formed a new shape in space. A rhombus drawn into a square, or a rhombus that goes beyond the limits of a square, forming 8 angles, an 8-pointed star, these are all symbols of the primordial knowledge about the spiritual liberation of man. These symbols were known to people already in the times of the Paleolithic Age. Figure 36. Variations of representation of the rhombus as a symbol of transformation and spiritual liberation of man. All these images and symbols were based on the knowledge of spiritual practices, particularities of awakening of the spiritual forces in human, a manifestation of the moment of fusion of the personality with its soul. Incidentally, the process of reaching such a spiritual fusion, enlightening, perceiving the truth, was designated in ancient times with a symbol that looked like a bug. Figure 37. The symbol of spiritual liberation, enlightenment, attainment of the truth. Notably, it was originally placed in reference to a personality which has matured spiritually, regardless of whether it was a woman or a man. Often, the arms in this sign were depicted with a symbolic sign of Allat, and the legs were in a form of 2 spirals twisted in different directions. Spirals in the sacred knowledge about the human being are, as a rule, conditional designations of either direction of energy movement in the process of spiritual practice or of the powers of Allat, if it is connected with information about the origin of the world. A spiral twisted clockwise meant positive, creating spiritual forces, while a counterclockwise spiral referred to negative, destructive forces of the animal mind which opposed the powers of Allat. In the designation of spiritual practices, symbols of spirals were used in the meaning of energies or of their fusion. Also, the spiral of 3½ turns designated the energy which in the East, as I have already mentioned, is still being called the sleeping Kundalini serpent, and which symbolizes the hidden energy potential of the human being. Figure 38. Examples of 2 differently oriented spirals in the symbolism of ancient peoples. Later, instead of the above-mentioned sign that looks like a bug, female goddesses began to be depicted, thus designating the process of attainment of spiritual fusion with the soul and liberation of human from the material world. Thus, people recorded one of the original additional explanations that a human being can achieve such a state only with the participation of the creating powers of Allat, the divine feminine principle. Also, indications that were similar in meaning were used in the form of 2 spiral snakes entwined with each other. If such a symbol was depicted together with an image of a person doing a spiritual practice, then it was usually indicated that the tails of the snakes were coming out of the person's first chakran, Muladhara, the bodies were entwined by 3½ turns, and their heads were close to the 7th chakran, the 1,000-petal lotus. Thus, the path of movement of this energy in the human energy body was conditionally indicated. The Eastern treatises which narrate about spiritual practices still refer to the awakening of the Kundalini serpent as the attainment of the spiritual state of enlightenment, an escape into nirvana. By the way, thanks to such an associative symbol, previously connected with spiritual knowledge, some people still revere ordinary snakes, which are found in their localities, as sacred reptiles. 1. 1b. 1d. 1c. 2b 2c 3. 4 5. 6 7. 8. 9. 10 11. Figure 39. The symbol of human spiritual liberation in designations of the ancient peoples. Petroglyphs of the ancient people, A. Rock carvings discovered in Camo-Nica Valley, circa 4th millennium BC, Val Camo-Nica, foothills of the Central Alps, northern Italy. B. Rock carvings found on the coast of the White Sea, circa the 3rd millennium BC, Republic of Karelia, northwestern Russia. Many of the local petroglyphs are visible only at sunrise and at sunset, the time of the morning and the evening spiritual practices, C. Petroglyphs found in the valley of AllatRA, 12th millennium BCE, Colombia, South America. D. Petroglyphs found in the northwestern part of Brazil, 10th to 7th millennium BC, South America. Symbols of the ancient archaeological culture Kitulhuaq, 7th millennium BC, Anatolia, Asia Minor. A. Image of a goddess with marking of the energy center, the soul. B. Sign from the graphical symbols of this culture. C. Image of a frog goddess, a symbol of revival, under which a bull's head with wide-set horns is placed. The end of the 7th millennium BC, an artifact of a temple of the Kitulhuaq culture. An ancient sign of the Indian culture. A schematic representation of the mother goddess of the ancient Slavs as well as of the Tripoli culture, the 4th to 3rd millennium BC, Ukraine. Russian embroidery image of a woman in childbirth. Fragment of an ancient Greek vase, Cadmean amphora, circa 680 BC, showing Artemis as Pontius Theron, mistress of beasts. The reverse swastikas and the attacking dogs represent an aggressive world, while Artemis herself is represented as a spiritual manifestation in this world. The image of fish on the clothes of Artemis is a symbol of immersion in an altered state of consciousness. The 6 bars on the clothes symbolize 6 dimensions. The head of Artemis is slightly touching the body. This is a symbol of the 7th dimension. The birds indicate the spiritual, higher world. The 2 snakes on the sides of the image symbolize achievement of the state of the highest spiritual enlightenment, liberation. A golden plaque depicting a Scythian goddess, 4th century BC, tumulus large Bliznytsa, Taman Peninsula, Krasnodar region, Russia, the Hermitage Museum, St. Petersburg, Russia. Sacred color sand painting of the Indian Navajo people, North America. Image of a Scythian goddess under a silver dish handle, 4th century BC, tumulus Chertomlik, Dnepropetrovsk Oblast, Ukraine. A carved plaque with an image of a goddess, 7th to 8th century, an archaeological finding near Lake Chud, Perm region, Russia, Cherdinsky Local History Museum named after Pushkin. A figurine of the Aztec goddess of water, Chalchiatlicue, 300 to 400 years AD, North America, the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico, Chalchiatlicue. She is dressed in jade, she is in a blue dress, was depicted as a young woman, she guided the righteous over the heavenly bridge, the rainbow. Anastasia, yes, thanks to the ancient artifacts discovered in different corners of the planet, there is already a lot of evidence attesting to people's special attitude towards the sign that looks like a bug and towards images of goddesses that are similar to it. However, strange things are happening in science today. The spiritual aspect of these artifacts is hardly ever considered and most explanations amount to the material understanding, as if on purpose. The spiritual significance and the role of these symbols in cultures of different peoples are being belittled. For example, scientists are often faced with ancient artifacts in the form of goddesses with lines twisted into spirals or spread out in a semicircle in place of legs, or little snakes twisted in a spiral. But they attribute practically all these findings to a woman in labor in a frog position or to anthropomorphic creatures in a frog position which are associated with the magic of fertility and represent a woman's pose, and so forth. In general, they connect it to the material aspects of existence without the spiritual component. Rigdon, well, whatever worldview people have, so are their conclusions. If modern people paid more attention to true spiritual self-perfection, they would better understand the ancient people's concern about their spiritual development. Here is a simple example. In the 1960s in the southern part of central Turkey on Konya Plain, archaeologists discovered the city of Kitulhuaq, dated to the 7th millennium BC. And underneath it, there were 12 more layers, the building horizons of cultures that had existed before that time, in a manner of speaking. Anastasia, yes, it was a sensational discovery for the scientific world. Ancient buildings, an outside narrow entrance to the premises was made on the flat roof, sanctuaries, plagues, figurines, crystalloids of geometric forms, and remains of polychrome wall paintings. According to the scientists' calculations, this ancient city could accommodate about 7,000 inhabitants simultaneously. Rigdon, quite right. Now, almost every house there had a special room. Scientists provisionally called it the sanctuary and, putting it in our words, it was a room for spiritual practices. They tried to place it in the center of the dwelling. The walls of such a room, especially the eastern and the northern ones, were painted with frescoes, the length of which reached from 12 to 18 meters. But what is most interesting is what was portrayed on them, a goddess in the form of a woman positioned in the pose of the said bug, or as scientists call it, in the frog pose, with animals and birds, that characterize the four essences, beside her, as well as symbols in the form of the AllatRA sign, a crescent with horns pointing upwards, a rhombus, two vertically connected triangles, in the form of an hourglass, two horizontally connected triangles, in the form of wings of a butterfly, symbols in the form of honeycomb, seeds, and waves. At that, these symbols could be found in different combinations, on top of one another, somewhere they doubled or tripled, multiplied, were depicted in terms of positivity and negativity. The goddess was drawn as a fish woman, a meditative immersion into an altered state of consciousness, as a serpent woman, a symbol of spiritual practices and the attainment of the state of spiritual enlightenment, and as a bird woman, connection with the spiritual world. These stories also had women carrying fishing nets which, in turn, pointed at the placement of signs by a group that was doing spiritual practices. Furthermore, in order to paint these frescoes, they used colors inherent to the soul in the state of transition, blue and green. This paint was mined from the copper ore, dark and bright red, from mercury oxide and red ochre, yellow, from iron oxide, gray, from galena, purple, from manganese, and, naturally, white. All this, together with signs and symbols, indicates that people possessed the primordial knowledge. Incidentally, there was the following tradition even in more ancient times. A group of people was doing spiritual practices together with their leader, an individual who worked on himself more thoroughly than the others and, therefore, advanced faster in his spiritual path. On the walls of the meditation room, in symbols and signs, he kept a record of the spiritual work, the attainment of knowledge, and learning processes of this group. But once the leader reached spiritual liberation, the walls of the meditative room were covered with a white coating. The new group leader began a new painting, like from a clean slate. Subsequently, this tradition transferred to the human society, where the emphasis was already placed on human life and the events of it. Anastasia, yes, all this testifies yet once again that people really worked on themselves spiritually. Moreover, spiritual perfection was natural for the society's way of life. This was not a passing fancy or a part of an individual's private life that is better kept secret from others, which is what you can see with modern people nowadays. Spiritual development was the ancient people's meaning of life. Moreover, the very society in which they lived not only maintained but also contributed to this process. You mentioned that the ancient people had a sign in the form of a wave. Rigdon, yes, the wave is an ancient designation of energy and its characteristics, or, as they would say today, of the energy field. If this referred to the spiritual, sacred knowledge about the human being, then the number of wavy lines or wavy stripes indicated energies of the dimension with which the person was working in a spiritual practice, or into what dimension he makes a transition, or simply symbolized the work itself in the invisible world. The wavy line in everyday symbolism was used as a designation of water or rivers. And in the sacred knowledge about the universe, the water was a symbol of the other world, which was different from the earthly one, so this is why the connection with the spiritual world was also often indicated in this way. Figure 40. Examples of depicting wave-like symbols. Of the ancient peoples. The proof of the fact that people possessed this spiritual knowledge already in the ancient times can be found now as well. The main symbols, such as a circle, cross, diagonal cross, triangle, rhombus, square, spiral, star, pyramid, crescent with horns upwards, as well as their modifications, are found on many archaeological artifacts. For example, they are on rock inscriptions, on figurines of the Paleolithic era, on ritual plates and dishes dating back to the Neolithic times, on symbols of holy garments, things, objects, and jewelry found in burial places. All this points to the fact that people possess special magical sacred spiritual knowledge during their lifetime. 1. 2 2b 2c 3 4 5 5b 6 7 8. Figure 41. Examples of depicting sacred knowledge. About the human being on artifacts of various ancient peoples. Petroglyphs of the Paleolithic era, rock carvings, Val. Camo Nica, Northern Italy. Female figurines with sacred symbols, different ways of depicting the goddesses of Tripoli, the Tripoli culture, the Kyukutani culture. In the first version, the symbols indicate a woman who has attained fusion of the soul with the personality, and escape into the seventh dimension, in other words, a highly spiritual personality. Her breasts symbolically show the movement of energy in the area of the chakran connected with life energy, prana. This uncommon indication means not only a spiritually developed personality, but it also says that this person could replenish life energy, prana, without harming others, which, in its turn, emphasizes the high spiritual status of this goddess. On her stomach, there is a symbol of rhombus, inside which there are a diagonal cross and 4 points, 4 balanced essences, which also points to the fact that this woman, goddess, controlled her essences. B. In the second version, the symbols indicate a woman who is spiritually developed, but who has not yet reached the fusion of her personality with the soul. 6 horizontal stripes on her chest indicate that she has perceived 6 heavens, but the rhombus with a diagonal cross, which is depicted on the stomach, contains a mark indicating activity of her left essence. This means that she does not yet fully control her essences. C. The third version has a female figurine from Tripoli with a geometric ornament of the pyramid, a designation of the main chakrans of the man and the AllatRA sign. The artifact was found near settlement Dragushin, Moldova. A sacred figurine, which is crowned by the sign of Allat, is covered with a notation of signs and symbols indicating the 4-part structure and other knowledge. Neolithic age, Central Mediterranean. Image on the stone slabs of the entrance to the tomb of Jinan, year 193 AD, Shandong Province, China, of the goddess of immortality Shi Wangmu with a stylized sign of Allat behind her shoulders, in the form of wings, as well as with symbolic figures of the lateral essences. According to the mythological description, they are hares pounding the potion of immortality in a mortar, standing on cylindrical pedestals. 3 connected pedestals symbolize the third dimension, according to mythology. They mean mountain peaks, and the mythical tiger Behu located in the place of the back essence, of the past. On the tiger's head is the left essence, in other words, emphasis is made precisely on it. In addition, the figure of the tiger is shown in motion, in other words, activity is shown. Different versions of the ancient Egyptian temple wall paintings. A. In the first case, the AllatRA symbol stands on top of the Ankh sign. B. In the second case, the Ankh sign is hung as a key to the symbol of spiritual liberation. Ceramics of early Tripoli civilization, ornament of the inner decoration of a ritual bowl in the form of a truncated cone with an image of 4 spheres with snakes in each of them and of light arcs fringing them. A golden locket, pre-Columbian civilizations of Central America. Golden pendant for clothes, pre-Columbian civilizations of South America. For a person of knowledge, these symbols told a lot and were to him same as what an open book, written in an understandable language, is to us now. Ancient inscriptions, left on stone blocks, rocks, caves, roofs, and so on, particularly those that included signs and symbols indicating specific spiritual practices, as a rule, also designated the place where people worked on these practices. The place chosen for spiritual practices was special, often in remote caves or open areas. By the way, in the past, only a person of knowledge, who had personal experience in such practices, had the right to make such inscriptions on rocks. Today, these ancient people who left rock inscriptions are provisionally called Paleolithic shamans by scientists. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that even to this day such places have been preserved where records of entire generations were made and where people came to learn for thousands of years. Anastasia, yes, such stone books carved on rocks, each the size of a football field, are still being discovered by scientists. For example, rock carvings, petroglyphs, at the White Sea, Zalavruga City, Republic of Karelia, Russia, or the Swedish Namfersen, in the Angermanland province, and Tanuma, in Bohuslän, or in the foothills of the Central Alps in Val Camonica, Italy, or inscriptions of the African Bushmen in the Drakensberg Mountains, or drawings of the mountain plateau Tassili and Ager in the Sahara, and so on. Rigden, quite right. Later, symbols started to be used more often in a more mobile version as amulets, a constant reminder of the human's dual nature and of priority of the spiritual. And it must be noted that they were drawn knowledgeably, in particular, what symbol had to be placed where and why, on pectoral ornaments, houses, ritual dishes, and sacred figurines, which were just as respected in those days as religious paraphernalia is honored in the modern world. These symbols were also placed on certain objects as information that was recorded in a special way in signs, including those events that were to take place in the future, or as a guarantee that they will happen. Later, this was transformed into a kind of subject letter, for example, on the staff of messengers which had the corresponding notable signs. Thanks to this, a messenger from one nation or a community of people confirmed, so to speak, his authority and the special commission entrusted to him before the representatives of another nation or community. Anastasia, yes, staffs of messengers were used in ancient Europe, ancient China, also by the ancient African and Australian peoples. But this is known, perhaps, only to the researchers who work on these matters, but for the majority of people, these are little-known facts. However, in the modern society, the symbolic staff of Moses, the caduceus of Hermes, and so on that have been hyped in the modern society's literature that is available to the masses. Rigden, historical artifacts are little known because people themselves are not interested in these matters. Anastasia, that is so, and even for those who discover these artifacts with symbols and signs, the information there is not entirely clear, and that is why it is described at best as an ornament on ritual objects, as signs that are similar to certain sacred symbols of other peoples. Rigden, usually, such symbols were depicted on stone or on objects as a means of transferring spiritual experience to descendants. For those walking the spiritual path, these records of knowledge were spiritually significant. Anastasia, so, spiritual knowledge was more important and more significant to those people who lived thousands of years ago than, for example, a map with an exact location of countless treasures or cash savings in a bank is to a modern human being with a consumer format of thinking. Rigden, quite right. Even, about 10,000 years ago, spiritual knowledge was valued more than it is now. As they said in the East, knowledge is the real treasure which accompanies the one who possesses it everywhere. Anastasia, yes, what can be more important in humans' life than spiritual development? This is the main purpose and the meaning of life. The history of mankind recorded in signs and symbols has demonstrated the importance of this issue even in such distant times, regardless of the conditions in which people lived. For them, spiritual development was the most important thing, and the material life was secondary. And now, even though, compared to ancient people, the new generations live in more comfortable conditions, still, more often, they choose the priority of material values, burning through their life, wasting it, guided by the consumer priorities of society. Rigden, unfortunately, that is so. By the way, the ancient people treated such inscriptions as transmittal of the most important information to the next generation because everything in this life is transient, except for the spiritual. In ancient times, people had a better understanding that life in this world is too fleeting and it ends very quickly for various reasons, including natural disasters. And to avoid losing knowledge, it was left on the eternal stone. Certainly, all of the above mentioned applies to sacred, holy, ritual inscriptions because, in addition to these, the ancient people had, like in modern society, common, calendar, ancestral, historical, and other records. Some sacred working signs, those capable of influencing the physics of the invisible world, could also be used as a symbolic designation of a spiritual person who practiced this knowledge, had experience, and could share it with other people. Before, everything really was clear and simple. Those same signs and symbols, for instance, were drawn not just by whomever, and certainly not for the purpose of decorating your own beloved self as it is done now, usually, without understanding the essence. In ancient times, it was done by the people in the know who reached a certain level of spiritual development. It is now that people, like monkeys, hook adornments with different symbols and signs onto themselves without even realizing what they really mean and how they affect the unconscious. But the main thing for them is that it is cool, expensive, and that a neighbor is looking with envy. Nowadays, many irresponsible politicians and government officials place those symbols which are often slipped to them by Freemasons onto flags and emblems of cities and countries. They do not even stop and think why it is so important for Freemasons to put their sign or symbol in this region. Officials do not understand the difference between different signs and what trouble they are causing by this innocent act, condemning their people, including their families, to additional suffering. For such people, the subordinated to the material mind system has defined specific priorities, money and an area of the conductor of its power, so that the person would not think about anything bigger. It is now that leaders of different religions, imitating traditions of the past, clothe themselves in festive garments and decorate themselves with precious metals, stones, and emblems on which various symbols are depicted. Most of them have scarce information about the meaning of these patterns and signs, confining themselves only to the narrow limits of the concept of their religion, without even wondering about a more ancient use of these symbols in the spiritual culture of different peoples of the world and about their true purpose. On the whole, it is now that the outer is rich and the inner is empty. And earlier, only some 8 to 12,000 years ago, everything was different and had a meaning, modest, but with a lot of significance, outer, sign, symbol, and rich spiritual inner. Generally, it should be noted that for people who lived in those times, knowledge of symbols was so important and natural for their society that they could not even imagine that such valuable information could be forgotten or lost. Anastasia, you once mentioned that much later, when society started to lean towards the material way of thinking, the simple started to be replaced with the complicated. People complicated signs and symbols by additional interpretation, which came from the mind. Rigden, that is really so. When due to some causes, natural disasters, epidemics, and so on, transfer of spiritual knowledge was interrupted or its modernization from the human mind took place among the peoples, then the next generations would no longer understand it. People would interpret this information from their mind, literally from the perspective of their existing everyday experience. This is another factor that contributed to the subsequent distortion and misinterpretation of signs. Anastasia, yes, no matter which way you look at it, it all starts with the material inclination of humans' consciousness. And if society loses or distorts the essence and the meaning of original knowledge as a result of interference of the animal mind, this material inclination will only get worse in the consciousness of future generations. You know, pursuant to the information you told us, I found many interesting facts in the works dedicated to archaeological and ethnological matters. Of course, the research related to cultural layers of 12,000 years old BC is scarce, and most of the discoveries are accidental. But starting in the 11-7th millennium BC, many artifacts have been discovered, especially those related to signs. So then, while studying various cultural layers, one can easily trace in what period the phase of such an inclination towards matter was starting for this or that people. In the layers dating back to antiquity, scientists found more traces of peaceful life of people, a lack of signs of inequality among the inhabitants and, most importantly, evidence of priority of spiritual knowledge in society. Many artifacts with typical signs and symbols point to that. For example, remains of dwellings with rich murals graphics, steatite seals with signs, clay medallions with carved signs and symbols, fragments of ritual dishes with signs, pottery with rich ornamentation based on mythological stories, and women's clay figurines with sacred symbols on them. And already later on in the timeline, judging by the burials, there appear quite a lot of weapons and jewelry made of gold, silver, and precious stones. A significant stratification of the population takes place, there appear many poor burials while very few rich ones, and then there are whole castes of priests and warriors buried in gold jewelry, with weapons. Besides, if in the early days there was simply an exchange of goods among the population without much need for material hoarding, apparently, the values were different, they were of the non-material nature. Later on, gold, money, and trade appear with focus on accumulation of the material wealth by individuals and the corresponding stratification of the population, with the emergence of political and religious systems of government. In other words, you can trace inclination of the civilization in the direction of material thinking. I would say more precisely, towards domination of characteristics of the animal nature in society, the creation of nations on this basis, the emergence of slavery, and so on. Another thing that surprised me is the fact that the secondary school curricula of a variety of civilized countries mention information about the existence of the human society until the 5th millennium BC only in passing, referring to this period as prehistory and describing mainly everyday life, the material living conditions of the so-called in science prehistoric people. And the spiritual side of life of the ancient people is portrayed as primitive beliefs in magic, spirits, in existence of the soul in a human, in otherworldly mythical realms and gods inhabiting them. But earlier, there had been many interesting and meaningful things too. Why is this being concealed? For example, in certain periods of time, different communities of people in parts of the globe that were located at a considerable distance from each other suddenly started to move on a massive scale to a more civilized level of existence, as scientists say, to a culture of productive economy, to settled agriculture, to production of pottery with the same basic sacred signs, to domestication of animals, construction of houses, including two-storied ones in some places, with a clear plan of building big cities, and so on. And the myths and legends of the peoples that were geographically unrelated to each other mention that the locals were taught all this by people from the sky, and that is the origin of the belief that nature and life of people are governed by special supreme beings. Often, it is during these periods that signs and symbols started to appear on ritual ceramic dishes on a large scale. At the same time, these signs, essentially, the same ones, existed before that time in the communities of the people who lived on different continents, as evidenced by rock carvings, petroglyphs. The signs were found even in rock drawings painted 35,000 years ago. Rigden, it is simply that, as I have already said, certain signs and symbols existed in society initially. Anastasia, yes, and this simple fact is being persistently ignored, probably due to lack of primordial knowledge in matters so crucial for the human civilization. So, I found some interesting information in the libraries about those ancient archaeological cultures that you mentioned in the conversation about signs. These are ancient civilizations that existed in Europe and Asia either well before the known Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations or during the same time period. For example, as you have already said, the Tripoli culture which existed in the 4th to 3rd millennium BC in ancient Europe, the current territories of Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. It is known in Romania as the Cucuteni culture, by the name of the nearest settlement where the first archaeological findings associated with this culture were discovered on those territories. A lot of ceramics with sacred symbols had been found in the cultural layers of this period. At that, The dishes were of two types, ritual ones, with the ornament of signs and symbols, and common ones, simple, without drawings. Figure 42. Symbols and signs of the Tripoli civilization. 4th to 3rd millennium BC, Ancient Europe. I would like to mention another important fact that you once pointed out to us. In those settlements, many female figurines with carved sacred signs and ornaments were found, which indicates that these peoples honored the creating feminine principle. It is also noteworthy that during the excavation of other ancient cultures, not only an abundance of such signs on ceramics was found, but there were also many women's pieces of adornment with the same sacred symbols and female figurines with signs. The burials of women shamans who possessed the sacred knowledge during life were found nearby as well. The objects and many other features found in burial places pointed at that. This testifies that women took a very active part in the spiritual life of society as well as in the rituals, and that it is the feminine divine principle that was especially honored by people in ancient times. Rigden, so it should be in a harmonious spiritually developed community. Because the feminine principle in the spiritual aspect is precisely the manifestation of the creating power of Allat.